Okay, we are going to start for the evening. It's about 6 o'clock, so off we go. This is the first lecture on Damon Galgut's The Promise, and it will make up Learning Unit 4 of this semester. This last book is a novel, so it's a fictional piece of work written by a South African writer and links us once again to the themes of place and space in South African literature. And that's mostly what we're going to be discussing over the course of our study of this book. Other things as well, but mostly talking about what role place and geography plays in this book, how the characters interact with it, and how it forms actually the central part of the whole plot of the book as well. The book is called The Promise, and it is about a promise linked to the land. So everything that I say in class, more or less, is going to link back to land once again, to land, place, space, geography, anything to do with how people are interacting with the location that they are living in. So thought it'd be good to give you a little bit of introduction to Damon Galgut himself, the author. He's a South African writer, a modern South African writer. A lot of what we've been studying so far are books from the past or are books set quite a long time ago. The Promise is also partly set in the past, but is very much a book about modern South Africa and looking at South Africa through a modern lens. Damon Galgut's a South African writer. He was born in the 1970s in Pretoria, South Africa. He's not anymore, but he's a white male South African author. But growing up in the 70s and 80s in South Africa would have been a young white man in apartheid South Africa. He went to Pretoria Boys High School, which is actually the same school that Elon Musk went to. And as a young man, was also conscripted into the South African National Defence Force during the various things it did during apartheid at home and on the African continent to keep things politically, quote unquote, stable. But he is a guy who never really believed in all that stuff. Growing up young, white male in South Africa meant that he's kind of top of the pile. Going to an all boys Afrikaans school like Pretoria Boys is kind of a place that's setting you up to be a leader in society one day, but a leader of what? It was a leader of an apartheid society, basically, which, based on the books I've read of his, certainly does not match with his general outlook on life. He's a writer who's very interested in, telling stories about South Africa and South Africans, but from an unusual perspective. He really wants to show how things actually work in South Africa. He doesn't want to put a nice sentimental gloss on things. He's not trying to be a patriotic writer. He's not trying to describe the place in the way a tourist brochure would. What he's trying to do is show something a lot more complicated, trying to see the country from as many angles as possible. And in this book, during as many historical time periods as he can himself remember about that happened in South Africa. In an interview I found, he says that when he was writing the book, he was actually writing the story under a different title. So it wasn't called The Promise, it was called something else. It was called Dark Love, which was an abstract allusion to one of the characters in the book, the main character, actually. One of the more, it's not right to say she's a main character. It's more accurate to say that she's one of the three most important characters in the book, Amor Swart. We'll talk about it a bit later. But Amor means like love, and Swart, of course, means black in Afrikaans. So he was calling the book Dark Love, which is sort of the same name as Amor Zwart. But he came up with that title not just for that reason, but also because he said that if one loves South Africa, it has to be a dark kind of love, which is a bit of an unusual thing to say. What he means is that if you love South Africa, it's not necessarily a kind of patriotism, because it can be hard to be patriotic or nationalistic about South Africa a lot of the time. But it is possible to love it. But it's always going to be a dark kind of love, a love that is a bit tinted with an understanding that the country is a bit of a mess, that it's, dangerous, there's many shortcomings, it's beautiful, but it's harshly beautiful. It's a tough kind of a country. Makes me think a little bit of those early poems we did at the beginning of the semester by Elizabeth Clutie and Olive Schreiner, who talk about the ruggedness, the hostility of the land to people, and that in order to, once you find a way to love that land, you really, really do love it, but not in a patriotic sense, in a kind of tough love way. It's complicated. It's not straightforward. What you love about it might also be something you come to not love about it. What you hate about it is also what makes it special. So it's never just a straightforward kind of attitude. The book did very well. It won a major prize in the English-speaking world called the Booker Prize, which is the top award given to any book published in English in the world. So it was kind of regarded in 2021 as the best book written in English in that year. So obviously it's got something important to tell us. And that's why we study it. What is happening in the book? Not just what it's about or what happens, but what is the undercurrent? What's the kind of, I don't just want to say message, but what is it that Galgut's trying to communicate to us about South Africa in this book? The book has a particular premise and a story line and a structure that's slightly strange or unusual, atypical. It's not a book that has like chapters. It's a book that has 4 different, almost standalone, but also interconnected sections in it. 4 sections, okay? The first book, I'll say the first section, is set in the 1980s. The second section is set in the 1990s. The third section is set in the 2000s. And the fourth and final section is set in the 2010s. It's about 2015. So it goes in 1985, 1995, 2005, and 2015. Those are the years or the decades the book is in. And each section, the book tells the story over just about a few days in the life of this family called the Swart family. And every time we visit them over those few days, every 10 years, the reason we're visiting, and the reason they're visiting each other, is because somebody in the family has died. They've been killed or they've died of some cause. And the chapter is built around their death or their funeral and the aftermath of their passing. That sounds pretty grim and quite bleak, and it is, but it's also the story can be very funny and very dramatic, sometimes quite over the top. You'll see that each of the 4 sections is named for a character in the book, and that character is the one who dies in that section that is named for them. So we start with Ma, which is a chapter dedicated to, or is about the death of the mother in the Swart family. The second one is called Pa, and that is the death of the father. And over the course of the book, the Swart family, it starts very, quite young, alive, pretty successful, middle-class South African, Afrikaans, English family. Over the course of these 4 sections, the family actually shrinks. It gets smaller and smaller as more of them die. This is mirrored also in the land that they occupy. They live on a farm. A lot of the action happens on the Swart family farm, and the farm also actually shrinks. More of it gets bitten off as they have to sell parts of it off, or other people come and live on the land. So you get a sense of a family that's actually shrinking and getting smaller and smaller as the country that they live in is changing as well, right? So when we first meet them in the first section, the family is complete. Got ma, pa, and then three children. Okay, one boy who's the oldest son. His name is Anton. Then a second child, middle child. His name is Astrid, and then the baby of the children, Amor, who's a little girl, about 11 or 12 years old when we first meet her. Their parents, Ma and Pa. Marnie is the dad. Rachel is the mother. Marnie is a kind of typical white Afrikaans male of the 1980s, raised in apartheid South Africa. His wife, Rachel, is quite different to him because she's actually an English-speaking woman, also Jewish. And these two have combined, a kind of odd combination, an Afrikaner and a Jewish woman, to create this seemingly typical South African family living out their lives on a farm just outside Pretoria. And when the story begins, we don't actually get to see the family complete because the mother Rachel has just died. She's just passed away of cancer. She's died on the farm, and our first introduction to the story in the first section is young Amor, the daughter, finding out about this, being told by a teacher and her aunt that her mother has finally died of cancer. She needs to go home. Because she's been told this at school, where she's a boarder. She's boarding there as a student, as a girl. She needs to go home back to the farm to be with her father and her siblings who are going to join her there as well as they deal with their mother's death. The reality of the farm is very important for the book. Okay, Galgut chooses to set the story on a farm, I think, for a very specific reason, to do with South African literature itself, as a kind of commentary on South African literature itself. I might have mentioned this previously, but there is a genre in South African literature called the plaasroman. Plaasroman is an Afrikaans word. Plaas means farm, roman means a novel or story or book. So it's the story of the farm. The reason this is important is because the farm story, the story of the farm, is very important, not just in South African literature, but in South African culture, broadly speaking. In many ways, you can say that the story of the farm is the story of South Africa. And for a long time, the story of the farm was told in a way to stand in for the story of South Africa itself, namely that you will have family living on a farm somewhere in South Africa, being productive. They've dominated the land, they control the land, they've settled the land, they've made it their own. Now they use the land to produce food and meat and clothes for the rest of the nation. There will be, on this farm, there will be a strong patriarchal figure, the father, a strong matriarchal figure, the mother looking after the children. The children will be somewhat educated, but only educated insofar as it's useful for when they inherit the farm themselves one day and carry on this lineage of being farmers on the land. And the two things, the nation and the farm, in this cultural telling of a story, become the same thing, right? The farm becomes symbolic of the nation, of the country. This family on the farm becomes symbolic of how people need to behave in order for the country to be successful. So as you might guess, the story has some blind spots to it, of course, because in order for this story to exist at all, you need for the land to have been colonized and settled and dominated by people who don't actually come from there. Here's a name you'll recognize, Olive Schreiner. She wrote one of the poems we discussed earlier this semester. Her most famous work was not actually those poems, but rather a book called The Story of an African Farm, right? Which was really one of the foundational texts of South African literature, and which then spawned this whole long tradition of the story about the farm and the farm, the family and the farm as being stand-ins for the nation and the people, and kind of creating all of these norms around how we are meant to understand our role in this country, what it is, how it works, and what we need to do to maintain control of it. And literature often functions that way. It becomes the kind of unwritten laws of a culture, of a society. A country's literature, the story that it presents of itself, has origins, and these origins are inescapable. And from those early beginnings, all subsequent national literatures must flow and or speak back to them and mimic them, and reiterate them so that they are not forgotten, they don't go away, and become retaught over and over. They become canonical. They become part of what we think of as being the key expression of our society and how it operates. Okay. And so, even a couple of 100 years after that literature's first been produced, even if you write a modern novel of South Africa, in a way you are still speaking back to the early versions of our literature, because you don't write without making a kind of contextual contribution to all the things that have come before. You speak within the context of the existing understanding people have, right? And in South Africa, like I said, this main key national story for a very long time was the story of rural life, the farm story, the farm novel, or the plaasroman. So Galgut is actually writing in the year 2021, he's writing a plaasroman, right? Which is kind of old-fashioned. But like I said, if you write literature in South Africa, it's very hard to escape what's come before. And so even if you reject what's come before, you are still writing in the context of your literary tradition. So here he's kind of just looking it straight in the eye. He's not writing around it or thinking around it or trying to ignore it or trying to restart the whole tradition. What he's trying to do is write afresh within an existing context. Take something old and traditional and breathe, in a sense, new life into it. As the country changes and becomes a different nation, so the literature of the nation must change as well. But how? And in this book, we see ways in which that is possible, and ways in which it occurs. Speaking of all this land and farms and all the rest of it, we're going to talk about, I wanted to talk about the premise of the book, which I'll do so now. The premise of the promise has got to do with this idea of the farm, right? So over the course of the book, which lasts about 30 to 40 years in time, although we only see snapshots of each decade as it passes and is presented to us, what happens is the family wrestles with this promise that their dying mother made to the woman who works on their farm as a kind of very loyal, long-suffering domestic worker. Her name is Salome, and when we first meet her, she's kind of in her 30s. And as Rachel dies, she promises Salome, who's looking after her in her last days, that she will force her family to give up part of the farm that Salome lives on. It's like a ramshackle house in the corner of the farmland, and that she will force her family to give her that house for free to live in and call it her own. That's a promise she makes. That's where the title of the book comes from. And over the course of all the years that go, from the 80s to the 90s, 2000s, the 20 teens, the family finds all these reasons not to live up to the promise, not to give Salome that house for various reasons, legal ones, political ones, economic ones. They find reasons to delay, defer, and not make good on their promise. Okay. And as I was saying earlier on, in the Plaasroman, the Plaas, the farm, stands in for something larger. It's a microcosm of something bigger, like a metaphor. A fancy word for it would be a synecdoche. It's a small thing that stands in for a larger idea or notion. Here, the promise is also a synecdoche, a small thing that stands in for a larger thing, right? So the failure of the promise is also the failure of the promise of South Africa, of the new democratic, free South Africa. As the book progresses and you see into the 2000s and the 2010s, South Africa becomes a kind of non-functioning, corrupt, a violent country that does not make good on its promise to the people, like Mandela's promise, the Rainbow Nation, all that kind of thing doesn't really come to pass. And so the promise that the Swarts make to Salome is also the promise that was made in a larger sense in the creation of New South Africa, which has also soured or gone south or also been deferred, delayed, corrupted by all these many failures that we've had to put up with as the people who live here. Right. So you've got to think of it in those terms. The farm, the land, the promise of the land is a symbol of a bigger failure in the country. Okay, the failure of the Swarts as a family to live up to what they said they would do is a mirror or a metaphor for all the promises we've kind of broken or have had broken on our behalf by our silly leaders over time. So the places in the book are obviously going to be the farm, which was important. We often also end up in a city, Pretoria, London, Cape Town, Durban. These cities appear in the book too. And then other smaller places like a school or even just a kitchen, a copy. A copy plays quite an important role for Amor in the book. Just these places characters end up in, which are very South African, very unique to South Africa, and are very special to the characters, as you'll see. The structure, like I said, it's got these 4 parts, 4 funerals, 4 deaths over a number of different time periods. Also, if you think of 4, what else comes in 4? We have 4 seasons, which represents a kind of cyclical nature of time, right? Summer, autumn, winter, spring, change, transitions. How some seasons are about kind of fertility and promise, whereas other seasons are about things dying and decay and cold and dark, but then also the promise of things improving on the other side. That's also kind of like how life works. Life is seasonal, it's episodic. It starts full of promise, and then as it draws on, it gets darker and colder as we get older. So think of it in those terms as well. Each of the 4 sections is set in a different season as well. He doesn't really tell you very often which, but sometimes he'll just let slip that, we're in autumn now, or now a big event is happening, and we know that the event happened in June of 95, which means the story is set in the winter, and the winter affects the weather of the book, the kind of the climate, which affects the feeling or the tone of that section. which creates a mood. So again, the weather, the place, the seasons all interact with the kind of tone that he's trying to create in the book. The other important thing is the narrator of the story. The narrator is the person who tells the story. There isn't a character narrator in the story. Instead, we have this very tricky, strange thing going on, which is that the narrator is kind of a character in his own or her own right. The character doesn't have a embodied self in the story, but is rather this kind of almost like a god-like presence in the story. The narrator is able to tell us all the action that's going on. Is able to see into the minds of all the characters who are kind of telling the story at that particular point, and is able to do this very strange thing where it seems to know and understand absolutely everything that's going on, kind of like an omnipresent, omnipotent God would know. So the narrator is this kind of all-knowing, all-seeing, tricky, playful presence in the book. You'll notice too that the story, the point of view, like whose action are we seeing in the book, or whose version of things are we inside? What point of view do we have? Jumps around a lot. It moves around different characters. One minute you're looking at the story through Anton, then through Amor, then through maybe a homeless person or a ghost or a spirit, and then a priest. And there's a lot of characters in the book who kind of have a walk-on role. They do something. We see the world through their eyes, through this mechanism of a narrator who knows all and can see all, and creates a very unusual effect where, on the one hand, you get to kind of see this very realistic portrait of South Africa, okay, because it's so all-encompassing and broad, but this free-ranging eye that looks around the world so much, like a camera that's just able to kind of be floating around the story and go anywhere it wants to, inside a scene, inside a mind or outside a mind, or zoom in, zoom out. That also allows Galgut to think about or to imagine all of the undercurrents at play in something. So we get the physical world, but we also get the display of the non-physical world, the metaphysical world, right? So we kind of get to see the thoughts, the innermost intimate thoughts of a character, or we get to see a character from inside their mind, but also we get to see that character from inside the mind of somebody else as well, and vice versa. So it's this kind of ongoing trick that he plays where he's able to see what anybody can see, the material world around us, but the narrator allows him to tell the story also of the undercurrents of the unsaid, the unspoken, the unseen, the invisible. Those things we can't actually see or know become visible in the story in the way that he tells it. So on the one hand, you've got a surface, but then he's always looking at what's also going on underneath the surface. So he shows us both the image, the visual, the surface, but then the metaphysical undercurrents at play beneath that. And what he often kind of reveals is that the surface is sort of true, but it's only a partial truth, okay? What's really true is actually what's invisible, the things people are thinking, the things they leave unsaid, the ripple effects of a person's actions as it goes out into the world are tell you more of the story than just the action itself. Okay, and he does that time and time again, over and over, with this tricky narrator that he's got. So what I'm going to do is look at the first section of the book today. The first section is called Ma. I've already been going for half an hour, so you probably have a good idea of the book already. But what I want you kind of focus on in the book is all the things that I've mentioned, is picking out parts of the place, what places you see in the book, how the farm is depicted, how the characters are depicted. I've spoken here about Amor and her, how we first meet her is that she's getting this terrible news that her mother has died. She knew her mother was going to die because she was terminally ill with cancer. She gets ripped out of the school one day and driven home by her aunt and uncle and taken to the farm. And this introduction to the farm also becomes an introduction to the family, to her father, to her sister, who's slightly older and kind of more attractive than she is, and also this like metaphysical strangeness that's going on in the story. One of the first things she does is actually to disappear briefly. She sneaks out of the house and goes to sit on the top of a kopje, little hill around the farm, which gives her this big view of the entire property, the house, and all of the farm. It's quite an interesting moment when we see that, considering we have to look at place so critically through the story. And we discover that not so long ago, a few years before that, she was sitting on the kopje as a 6 or 7-year-old girl, and she was struck by lightning one day, and it nearly killed her. It burned her feet up very badly. She was in hospital for 2 months, and one of her toes was blown off, and it's kind of left her as a little bit of a weirdo. There's a kind of suggestion that the lightning made her strange and weird. And indeed, throughout the story, she is a bit of a misfit in the Swart family. She doesn't really go along with them, doesn't see the world the same way they do, doesn't share their interests or their hobbies or their politics. And throughout the story is a stranger to them, literally and figuratively, because she spends a lot of time away from the family, estranged, and she's the only one in the whole book who wants to give Salome the house, who wants to live up to the promise. And she's always fighting and wrangling with her family, trying to get them to go along with it as well, but they never do. They always find a reason to fob her off and send her packing without the promise fulfilled. And that becomes in each section, it becomes a discussion point with her and her siblings or her parents, her surviving parent anyway, father. What are we going to do about the fact that our dying mother, as her last wish, as her last act, told Salome that she was going to give her the house? How are we going to make it happen? So that's one. So that's Amor Swart. This kind of misfit character. The other character who's really important is her older brother and the oldest son in the story, Anton Swart. So he's kind of, his life, I think, is slightly modeled a little bit on Damon Galgut himself. Not exactly, but they would have had kind of similar experiences, gone to a similar kind of school, and had the same sort of expectations placed upon them as being, young white men in 1970s, 80s South Africa as being the guys who were going to grow up and lead the country one day. We know now that that didn't happen. It wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to be the ones who led the country. But they were conditioned to, they were trained to. And that kind of promise of their lives went unfulfilled. They didn't get to do what they were bred to do, in a sense. They only sort of did. The way we meet Anton is on pages 35 to 40. Okay, and this is one of those moments where you see the narrator move in an interesting direction, like it breaks off from the story it's been telling, and it goes and seeks out Anton where he is. On the day his mother died, Anton is in the military. He's in the army. He's doing his conscription in the SANDF. So the story is set in 1985, which is the time period characterized by a lot of political violence and upheaval and instability here in South Africa and in surrounding countries too. There were a lot of political movements like the ANC, the PAC, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and others who were had taken up an armed struggle against the apartheid government, and the apartheid government wasn't going to take that lying down, and they had to send out the army into the townships of South Africa to quell the violence, because that's where those parties were meeting and kept their weapons, kept their resources, and were causing all sorts of trouble and instability in the country. This period, 1985 to 1986, was characterized by a lot of ongoing states of emergency, which meant that gave the government extraordinary powers to deploy the military where it want for the military to kind of do whatever it wanted to do without any repercussions, for people to be arrested and detained for a long period of time, thrown in jail without trial, to increase levels of censorship in the media about what was going on. You see all of these things playing out in the first section because that was the time. A lot of violence, uncertainty, in a bigger picture, but we just see it through the small figure of like really one guy, which is Anton. He's a 19-year-old kid. He's in the army. He's been conscripted into doing it, so he has to do it. And he is put into one of these things here. You can see today we kind of call this, I think, a Casper, but back then it was called a buffel. So the army soldiers would climb to the buffel and stick their weapons out these windows there, point them at people, and just kind of shoot if they needed to, in order to kind of bring, stability to all of the violence happening around them. Not that that worked at all, of course, but that was the idea. And Anton was just one of these regular foot soldiers when we meet him. What he's just done is, let me see here. Sorry, I'm just making sure I've got the right page. This is actually on page 36. We first meet Anton in just the first few hours after he's been on one of these patrols through the township in a buffel. And what happened is that he has shot and killed somebody during this event. A woman whom he saw picking up a stone and getting ready to throw it at him, and he shoots her. And we don't actually see the moment. We just hear him telling a chaplain about it. And in the moment, at the same time, the chaplain is there to tell him that his mother has died. And Anton, in his upset state, gets these two events kind of confused, where he thinks that because his mother is dead, and because he's killed this woman, that he, in effect, has actually killed his own mother. It's kind of like a crazy dream logic fueled by grief and trauma. This action that he's taken, he's never going to face any kind of legal consequences for it at all, but he does face, for the rest of his life, a kind of moral consequence for what he did. He never forgets it. It always haunts him. It's something we don't actually see him do. We just hear him say that he did it. But we come to understand that it's something that basically messes him up for life. Throughout the book, basically, his side of the story is how he goes increasingly crazy, and how his life, as it goes on into his 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, how it goes increasingly bad and sour. He is the last character to die in the book as well, and his end kind of shuts down a certain thread of South African life that was common not just to Anton, but a whole generation of young white South African men who, like I said, were bred to lead a society, didn't get to, and were actually very often destroyed by the great expectations put upon them, which never came to be, but also were destroyed by some of the things they had to do in the name of their generation, which was to be in the military, to be in the police, to be conscripted into this apartheid machine, which they didn't understand or didn't agree with or didn't like. And in that way, Anton's story is a tragic one. It's also linked to this idea of promise. Promise is potential, is ability, talent. Throughout the book, he's described as being intelligent and talented, but he never lives up to his talent. He never makes anything of it. It's a life that never really gets going. And it just kind of stops abruptly already when we first meet him. Okay, so it's a character to look out for and how he behaves and acts through this first chapter. Another important scene in the book is page 54 to 57. This is when the family gather on the farm to quote unquote enjoy a braai, and it's an event that goes very badly wrong. The South African braai is kind of an institution, isn't it? It's a thing everybody in the country does and enjoys. It kind of stands for something. It's a kind of a ritual, a family ritual, but also a national ritual. And in this braai, it devolves into a big family fight that also is something that rings throughout the generations with consequences. A lot of what goes wrong can be traced back to what happens at this braai, which is that Anton gets in a fight with his father's beloved and trusted dominee, reverend, who's helping him through the crisis of his wife's death, but also his own religious reawakening. And Anton says, "No, this guy's full of rubbish. I don't believe him. He's just a grifter and a scam artist, and we should have nothing to do with him." And that argument, that fight, which happens at the braai, alienates Anton from his father, but then also alienates Anton from the rest of the family. And what happens by the end of this first section is that the family kind of breaks up, right? Anton escapes and leaves. He drops out of the army. He goes AWOL, which was not allowed at the time. And he kind of goes off on his own into the wilderness, disappears off, and is gone. And only, like 10 years later, in section 2, do we pick things up again. And we have the sense of a lot of time having passed. 10 years goes by in the book with a single turn of the page, and you're in a different era, a different mood, a different zeitgeist, a different spirit, but the same characters. And we get to see them all then come back to the farm to deal with the death of another character. In chapter 2, it's the father. The father dies, which is important because at a symbolic level, the father represents the patriarchy, the father of the nation, the order, the foundation. He disappears, but he's not going to be replaced with the same order. He's not going to be replaced with the same patriarchal figure of Anton, who's a very different young man to Mani. He's kind of an opposite. He's a young man of the new South Africa, and things have changed. So the book is also all about this transition, families breaking up, coming back together in a new way, all while the land that they live on also changes, but remains the same. The laws that govern the land change, but the things that happen on the land more or less stay the same. So there's always this tension between change, stability, between light and dark, between good and bad, as the characters struggle on through the many years of their lives. So I think I'll do another video on this for you next week sometime, during which I'll cover the second chapter of the book. It was set in the 1990s, a very specific time period in South African history too. So I'll do a short video on that, just again indicating what pages I think are important. And the next time we meet, we will look at chapters or sections 3, which is set in 2000s during the reign of Mbeki, and we'll look at the end of the book, chapter 4 as well, set during the disastrous Zuma years. So you can see the book encompasses a whole long sweep of South African history as well, returning to the same characters as they change over the decades, and returning all the time back to the farm, but also returning every time back to the promise that they made to Salome, which they never live up to. Chapter 1, first section, ends with Anton explaining to Astrid why they can't give her the house. And in this chapter, the reason is that there are no laws that allow them to do that. So it was 1985, 1986. Literally, a black woman back then was not allowed to own a house. There was no way she could, they couldn't transfer the property into her name. They couldn't do it with the government. It was not possible. And that is an awakening for Astrid as to what kind of country it is that she actually lives in. When the country changes and she reminds her brother of this fact, he will find another different reason to avoid living up to the promise. And again, that avoidance is kind of a stand-in for the country itself going in the wrong direction, despite the many good changes. Okay, so all I can do is encourage you to keep on reading the book. It can be pretty serious and bleak, but it can also be very funny, enjoyable, very melodramatic. A lot of things happen in the book that are unexpected and enjoyable, shocking, amusing, and it really is an enjoyable read as a book. And I encourage you to read it. So I'll end it there for this evening and wish you an enjoyable rest of the evening. Cheerio for now.